Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Emerald City Hockey's Seattle Kraken podcast.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Deep Dive, Emerald City Hockey Seattle Kraken podcast. RJ, we've got a fantastic podcast today. It's our last one before the trade deadline, so we're going to be talking about the Kraken as far as if they should be making a move before the trade deadline, any moves we think that they could be making. I teased it last night on the postgame. I have an incredible trade proposal I'm so happy to have everybody here and find out about, but we're also going to be reviewing the games from this past week as well as hitting on some news and notes. But of course, got to start with the shout out to Queen Anne Beer Hall. RJ, Kraken going to be going back on the road, and you know what that means. It's a fantastic time for everybody to go check out Queen Anne Beer Hall. If you want kind of that Kraken home game experience with the lights, with the goal lights, with the music and the sound,
goal horn,
and being around everybody, the goal horn, everything, gotta go check out Queen Anne Beer Hall. It's a fantastic place to watch a Kraken game, especially during these road trips. I think it would be a lot of fun. So I want to give them a shout out. RJ, it was kind of a rough week. We'll get into the games and everything. But last week we talked about several things, as we do, and one of them was the idea of Chris Driedger and what the situation was going to be involving him as he's getting more practice time. Was he going to be worked back in? Are Kraken going to have to somehow try to carry 3 goaltenders before the trade deadline and all that kind of stuff? And in this past week, we have our answer as to what the Kraken were going to do.
Yes, and they put him on waivers, and this is something that we discussed earlier, and we disagreed on this too. Not to, pull this up to take a whole victory lap here, but, I did post the clip as he was placed on waivers and saying that I think that's what it's going to come to. And I, of course, cut it off right after you said, I disagree. Like, okay. So you're welcome there, Dylan.
Yes.
I left out the whole part where you make your very good and reasoned argument about why you disagreed. Just want everyone to know that you disagreed.
Well, I was going to say, it's probably good because I gave lots of good reasons why a team should, for free, pick up Chris Driedger off of waivers. So it's probably good that we didn't put that out there for rival general managers to hear and ponder, because we might have seen a different result.
That's right. We don't want them getting any ideas. But they didn't get any ideas. Good news for the Kraken here. So they ended up placing Chris Driedger on waivers and assigning him down to the Coachella Valley Firebirds after he cleared. So all the other teams in the NHL had an opportunity to pick up Chris Driedger essentially for free. Just you got to pick up that contract, which is this year and then one more year at $3.5 million cap hit. And every team declined to do that, having not seen him play coming off of the injury. That's understandable, I think. And but he goes down to the Firebirds for his next step, kind of towards an NHL return. He'll get some games in Coachella Valley. He'll try and work his way back. And this is something that Hackstall mentioned the day of. It's all part of the process of getting him back into NHL game shape and towards an NHL return.
Yeah, and the other thing being too, nobody probably that eager to pick up that contract a week before the trade deadline. So you're wanting to probably have maximum amount of cap space available. But yeah, this is the thing that makes the most sense as far as Chris Driedger staying a member of the Kraken organization. It makes sense to get him down to Coachella Valley, playing with that group. It's a great group of guys down there. It's a winning team. It's a fantastic kind of organization that they've got going on. Good building, incredible coaching staff, right? Like, this is a great place for him to come back and work his way back, get back used to playing games, you know what I mean? Like stress testing the body, all that kind of stuff that you've got to do. I think this is 1,000% the number one place for him to be. We're really, really happy for him. Happy for Coachella Valley too, because look, they're heading towards a playoff run to themselves, right? Like, they've been one of the best teams in the AHL all season long. And so to have a nice, solid, like NHL level veteran goaltender, it's certainly not going to hurt anything for him. That's for sure.
Yeah, and to do it via waivers too, I think is actually best for everybody, as opposed to having him on the clock for a conditioning stint or something where he's on that either a 2-week clock or a 6-game clock where you have to worry about bringing him up to the NHL level. And then what do? This just gives both sides as much runway as they need to get him right, to get him in game shape and do things the right way.
Yeah, definitely. So that's all solid, good news there. Another player within the Kraken organization coming back from injury in this past week that we should talk about, and that is Shane Wright. So Shane Wright, obviously, has been back down at the OHL level. He was traded to Windsor from Kingston, went back to the OHL, been playing really, really well with the Windsor Spitfires, and then, ran into an injury situation that's had him in and out of the Windsor lineup for a little while, but he appears to be back. Came back on the 23rd, posted an assist, and then last night had an incredible 3-point game. Some fantastic highlights from that one. Great passing, kind of, all over the offensive zone. I mean, he is lighting up the OHL. He's got 18 points in 9 games, 7 goals in those 9 games. Shane Wright, he's looking phenomenal for the Kraken down there in Windsor. So happy to have him back out on the ice.
For sure, and just happy to have him healthy. That's huge. He's been in and out of the lineup, in, back, out again, with that lower body injury. So you get concerned, because he also hasn't played a whole lot of games really the last 2-3 years.
Yeah,
you want him getting in games. That's why you send him back down to juniors. So he's playing now, and good to see the injury doesn't seem to have affected him negatively at all. It looks like he's picking up right where he left off.
Right, and maybe more important to Kraken fans, beyond the incredible numbers he's pointing up as far as goals and points. Last night, he went 11 of 19 in the faceoff dot. So that might be the most exciting thing that Kraken fans can hear, especially after this past week, RJ. How's that for a segue? Where, we talked about it last week. The big question around the Kraken and our kind of main topic of discussion was where are they really in this league? Are they one of the better teams? Are they a true playoff team? Are they a potential contender? Where do they actually fall? And one of the things that you had brought up was the idea of, look, they've been beating all the teams they should beat, but they hadn't beaten a playoff team in over a month at that point. And this past week, they were going to get the opportunity to try and do that, playing both against a Boston team that is on a historic run right now. I mean, they're just absolutely incredible. And then also against Toronto, coming back, bringing back some familiar faces in Mark Giordano and Calle Yarncroke. Overall, before we get to like the game by game, overall this past week, just to get it out of the way, it was bad. It was really bad. It was another rough week for the Kraken. I don't know that it was like the worst week we've ever seen, like 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago when we had kind of brought up that idea. But the bottom line is the Kraken, since we've last done this podcast, RJ, 0-3. And they're 3-6-1, I believe, in their last 10. And this is not the time of year to do that. It's the bottom line. We've watched them go from top of the division to a second wild card spot.
Right. And this time of year, you need to be banking points. And when you're not, you are going to fall in the standings, especially as tight as things are in the West. I think it was like a week ago where the Kraken were 3 points out of the number 1 spot in the entire Western Conference and 3 points out of the final spot, playoff spot in the Western Conference. So it is that tight. It has been that tight. And when you're not banking points, those are the kind of drastic changes you're going to see. And especially with the trade deadline coming up, it's really kind of changed the whole perspective of, okay, what are the Kraken looking at seeding wise? You can always, win more games and move back up. It still is really close. But yeah, dropping 3 games is really tough. And, going through that, San Jose, those are points you just can't afford to leave on the table. You can try and get them back with an impressive win against a Boston or Toronto, but ultimately, you blow a lead in that Boston game with 4 or 5 minutes to go, and you end up getting 0 points out of it. And then, of course, coming out against Toronto and not really being anywhere close to the 2 points, it starts to add up.
Yeah, it really does. It was just a rough week all the way around. Normally we would ask kind of like, well, what went wrong? But the bottom line is it was the same things that have been plaguing this team all season long, win or lose. And that's, power play wasn't really there. The offense was inconsistent and not really reliable, is a problem for them. Can't clear the puck out of your own end. Like, that's a big problem. They still can't figure out how to do that. Face-offs were absolutely atrocious, especially in that Toronto game. 29% for the Kraken. Like, that has got to be, I think, a season low. And you look at some of the guys, too. Like, Yanni Gourde has been the Kraken's best face-off man all season long. Last 2 games against both Boston and Toronto, a combined 4 face-off wins in those 2 games. Looking at a 15.4% and a 25% against Toronto. Like, that is absolutely crushing them right now. When you can't win those defensive zone draws, when you can't win an offensive zone draw, especially on like a power play, right? You're like trying to start a power play, can't win the face-off. Like, that's the problem. They can get an immediate clear. Next thing you know, 40 seconds later, you're back in the offensive zone. Like, that's the kind of stuff that is really crushing them right now. And I think is part of the reason why they've struggled against other playoff teams.
Yeah, it certainly has been a factor. And as the year goes on, as the season goes on, as Dave Haxtell loves to say, the type of hockey gets different, and those draws become much more important, and you're seeing the Kraken kind of lose more and more of those, and it starts to add up, and you're looking at, okay, how do you fix this? Is there somebody on the roster that can fix this, or not? And even though you're seeing improvements from players like Matty Beniers in the dot, which is great to see, you kind of need to see more overall from the team. But just one of the factors, it just feels like different things are going wrong, but it's always from that same checklist of things that we see all season. Another one that I wanted to add to that is net front defense. And this is something that really showed up last game against Toronto. Yeah. Dave Haxtell pointed out the Leafs love to throw a lot of pucks into those danger areas and scoring areas without, kind of clean possession or anything, but just throw pucks in there and then try and win those battles in front. And, they have a lot of skill, but they do have some bigger, heavier guys in that situation that can win those battles. And you saw the Kraken just kind of getting beat on that all night long. And just that net front defense, and also just the awareness of knowing where guys are, having another play, on the Liljegren goal, where all 5 Kraken skaters were on one side of the ice in their D zone. I mean, we've seen this a few times this week. That kind of stuff just needs to stop. And I would want to get into the X's and O's of it and all that. But I mean, even when Haxtell's telling you, it's just a mindset thing. The players know not to all be on all 5 of them on one side of the ice. Like, this is something they've been taught since they were young. We've been over this. Yeah. It's about just making that mental switch that has to happen.
Right. But this is, you've said it. I've said it. Haxtell's been saying it. We've all been saying that all season long. I mean, this goes back to the very beginning of the year when they kind of, stumbled very briefly out of the gate. We were talking about this, and Haxtell was talking about it that way. And it's one of those things, I hate to bring it up again, but if everybody knows it's just a mindset thing and this group just seems incapable of flipping that switch, then, and this will be more of our topic later as we talk about the trade deadline, does there then need to be a switch to your group? Because if this group, after 60 games, can't seem to figure that out and get it together for any prolonged period of time, is this a group you're comfortable moving forward with? And I think that that's something that, we've been able to avoid really having that tough discussion because of how well the Kraken had played through most of this season. But as they really struggle here, and as everybody is looking at the standings going like, oh, the playoffs, which seemed certain for so long, are now very much starting to look in doubt. I mean, do we have to have that discussion, RJ?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I think we will have that discussion later on in this podcast, as far as what they want to do at the trade deadline. And I think Ron Francis definitely has, some issues on his hands that he's got to make some decisions there. And I'm looking forward to kind of hashing that out. I mean, on the positive side of, even though you're dropping these points, when you look at the standings, yes, I think there is some reason for optimism. Agreed. Mostly because, I mean, pulling up the Western Conference standings right here, you kind of have a solid 8 to 9 teams, but really 8, unless the Flames get their act together. There's a pretty big gap between Seattle at 8 and basically, 9, 10. And I mean, Nashville is already a major seller. They've just sold off some big pieces. They're going to probably head downwards. St. Louis and everybody below that is going to be out of it. So really, you're left with 9 teams for 8 spots, and Calgary being that 9th team. And I mean, they just are not looking very good right now either. Right. So thankfully, at least it looks like it's still a good proposition as far as getting in. But you do have to start worrying about seeding. You don't want to play whichever team comes out of the West hottest.
Exactly. And I talked about this a little bit before you were able to join us on the on post game after that Leafs game about, look, it's not just Seattle. You look at the team Seattle's really, really going at it with, and you look at an Edmonton, and they're 4-2-4. Now, the one thing you could say in their last 10, the one thing you could say about them is, yeah, they only got the 4 wins. They at least got 4 loser points. Like, they're finding ways of losing in overtime and banking points, which is kind of what you need to be doing this time of year. But you look at Calgary, 3-4-3. Again, they're not performing very well right now either. So it's kind of nice in the sense that if Seattle is kind of taking a step back, it seems like those teams closest to them are also starting to take a step back right now. And that does help keep this from looking as as bad as it could be looking potentially if everybody else was playing super hot and the Kraken were going through the same rough stretch. Things could look very different. They could look a lot worse, and the bottom line is that they don't. Another thing, just before we kind of go game by game, because I do want to get to that game by game breakdown, is we talked about it on the post game live yesterday after that Toronto game. That Toronto game felt very much just like a game from last season. The Sharks game felt very much like a game from last season. And let's just take a moment to appreciate that, that was just our reality last year. And now those very much feel like outliers, like, what the heck just happened? Like, that wasn't good, whatever. You know what I mean? Like, it feels very much like it came out of left field, where that was just the place we were living in last year. So it shows just how far this team has come year over year, and how kind of spoiled we've been with how good this team has played.
Agreed. Agreed.
It's a good one right there.
Teed up for so agreed. It's easy to take that for granted, when you see the success the team has had this year. Yeah, I mean, and Dave Haxtell brought this up after the Toronto game too. He's like, look, this is a better spot than a lot of people thought we'd be in at this time of the season, and like, we'll take this. 23 games or however many games to go, all meaningful. We'll take that. So worth keeping that in mind. That's true.
Absolutely. All right, so let's go game by game real quick here. Let's start with the Maple Leafs game, just because we've talked about it a lot, and it really was that kind of final cherry on this past week. But I want to talk about it. We talked about the faceoffs, 29% again. That's really bad. 0-2 on the power play. Those are power plays later in the game too, where you had a chance to get back in it and you weren't able to get into it. But the place I want to start with, RJ, is with Philip Grubauer, because really, and this wasn't all his fault at all, but he gets pulled for Martin Jones in this one, and this was by far and away the worst statistical performance that Philip Grubauer has had in a while.
Yeah, certainly this calendar year. And you kind of felt it from the start too. He just looked off of his game. I tell you, being there in the building and getting to watch him, the way he positioned himself, the way he was moving across the crease, something just felt off. He didn't look like, his normal self from this year. And then, of course, that first goal that goes through him, the Giordano goal, you have to stop that. I mean, that's just a goal that goes right through you. And also, that's just kind of a pivotal moment in the game, too. Again, you said this game felt like last season. There were a lot of those early goals against last season that just kind of set the tone in the worst way for the Kraken. I felt like that was one of them. Like you said, this game was, it was not Grubauer's fault entirely by any means, but he just had an off night. And I think you have to acknowledge that can happen for any goalie. It just wasn't his night. He wasn't feeling it. And I was kind of thinking that after, the third goal. And then also, Mitch Marner scores a goal that doesn't end up counting. It was on a delayed penalty. The Kraken got a touch. But, he lets that in clean from that spot. At that point, I kind of knew, okay, he's not feeling it. But it is, I don't want to even say unsettling, because it's just one game.
Right.
Basically all calendar year. But he just wasn't on it that last night.
Yeah, and that's why originally it was like, oh, okay, content creator brain is going, and it's like, oh, do we talk about like, oh, is this the first signs that maybe Hackstall needs to start up with the switch or to try to even things out as far as workload with a Martin Jones? The problem is, I don't know, things just for everybody on the Kraken were so off last night. It's kind of hard for me to say like, okay, we need to be on it there, because I've talked in the past about I want Hackstall to try to be a little bit more like, trying to read it before it totally gets there as far as which goalie is going to be your 1A as part of this tandem. But I don't know that you can use last game entirely to say like, oh, okay, I think we should start transitioning back to Martin Jones.
Yeah, I don't think so. And especially Jones has got to show you that he's better also, which, hey, he did well in relief in that game.
Yep.
He only allowed one goal, and it was on this perfectly executed 3-on-2 gorgeous play by the Leafs. Like, you can't blame him at all for that. But otherwise he looked solid. So maybe he can build some momentum off of that. But yeah, I think Jones has to show you more as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, we'll get to him when we talk about the Sharks game. But with this Maple Leafs game, one of the things that was also, and this is a big part of the Boston narrative as well, you get the response goals are back, right? Talking about feeling like last year, that Mark Giordano goal, it's a response goal, right? You got this incredible offensive sequence. It results in this Vince Dunn goal. It's one of the prettiest goals the Kraken, from like an offensive X's and O's standpoint, have been able to pull off all season long, RJ. And then that kind of crushing response goal there, saw it multiple times in the Boston game. I mean, that the entire Boston game was just response goals for both teams. That was just the only way anybody seemed to be able to score. But it was just, I don't know. It's one of those where it's starting to get a little concerning again.
It is just the fact that that's cropping up, and especially as you head toward the playoffs, you need to be able, if you score a big momentum goal, I think even playoff hockey is even more about momentum than regular season hockey.
Yes,
it's
very
just
much.
the ebbs and flows of a series like that. If you score a big goal or a goal in any point in a game, you have to be able to prevent that momentum from going right back the other way against you. It is absolutely crucial in playoff hockey, and especially good teams, experienced teams will take advantage of that. And you see how they come out for shifts after they've just allowed a goal. And again, it's the kind of problem the Kraken just, need to find a way to fix. And I think, again, it's just a mindset thing, right? You're going for the shift after a goal you just scored. It's coming. A push is coming.
Yes.
You just have to play solid defensively. And going back to that Bruins game, the one goal that Hackstall said just can't happen is the tying goal, where Boston ties it late in the third after the Kraken went ahead on the Schwartz goal, where he said, look, we didn't make them earn that one. They weren't defending that hard. I mean, it was the kind of play where I forget who it was that finished it off, but they were kind of wide open on the other side of the ice with everybody on the Kraken over on one side. It's that kind of focus that you have for most of the game. You just got to make sure to have it on that shift, such a pivotal shift.
Agreed. No, it's definitely one of those things they're going to have to figure out here, because that you just can't continue to live like that. Essentially, is you're never going to find success, certainly later in the season and come postseason time. The final thing that I want to talk about in this one was, I felt like this was by far and away the Kraken's worst forechecking game in a long time, in the sense that it just didn't happen. I'm struggling to remember like any moment in which like the forecheck made any sort of difference whatsoever. And then also offensively, I talked about how incredible that Vince Dunn goal sequence was. Otherwise, though, I have no idea what the Kraken were trying to do in the offensive zone against this Toronto team. A Toronto team that, as the Vince Dunn goal showed you, is very exploitable on the back end. Like, you can make things happen against them if you want. You just have to put in a little bit of work. And instead, what we saw last night, RJ, and this is something we talked about on the deep dive for months in post-game lives, all sorts of stuff. We talked about one thing, and that's net front presence, right? And the Kraken need to have a net front presence. Well, last night we saw something different as I pull out the whiteboard here for those with the video version. And we saw something like this, where instead of having no net front presence, we had too much net front presence, where we stuck two guys net front right there at the crease and then just left some poor puck carrier to try to figure out a way of doing something all on their own, all like over here doing all sorts of stuff and just being surrounded by Maple Leafs, because what is one person supposed to do? The defense didn't activate and come down to help them. They stayed up at the blue line. And so there was multiple times last night, RJ, from different lines where we saw that look, where one time it was Brandon Tanev just holding onto the puck. He's essentially got nothing to do with it, because you've got two guys net front just battling net front for positioning. I'm like, what was that? I have no idea where that came from. It was such a massive overcorrection, but I've just never seen that at the NHL level ever, RJ. Two guys net front like that, like in the crease net front.
Yeah, and 5-on-5 as you're trying to circle around and make something happen. Usually, what'll happen is if the puck carrier doesn't have any options to go to the DR and activating, one of those guys will just kind of circle out and give him an outlet. But it really wasn't happening, and I don't know. I mean, the Kraken generated some decent chances in the second and third period as they were putting on a push. A lot of those on the power play too, and
yeah,
we, talk about that a little bit. The power play actually looked all right at times. But it was an interesting departure there, an interesting adjustment, because you didn't see that like right early in the game. I mean, looking at that Dunn goal, the D's activating, you're having guys, hit the Leafs with speed, which is what you need to do.
Right.
But it just seemed like they kind of got thrown off after that Leafs onslaught at the end of the first, and they're like, okay, we need to change something, and that was the answer.
Yeah, we just need to have a wall of bodies in front of Samsonov, I guess.
Well, I mean, hey, look, they're like, oh, well, the Leafs throw a bunch of guys, at that spot, and they throw pucks to the high danger areas, and they win the battles once they're there. maybe we'll get a bounce like on the Tavares goal, but those bounces don't happen too often.
No, they don't. You can't rely on that. And that, oh man, that Tavares goal hurts because we talked about it last night. Everybody was in the right spot. Both defenders are taking guys net front. You got Yanni Gourde back checking into the crease essentially on Tavares. It was just a half-second window, and the Leafs were able to capitalize on it. That was a rough one. Talk about the Vince Dunn goal one last time. That works because you've got players crisscrossing through the zone. They're playing east-west through the zone. That confuses defenses. Guys are having to trade off defensive assignments. That is always where you can open up space. You can open up gaps, not just for passes, but for bodies, very much just like Vince Dunn. He activated right into a gap there in the slot and was able to score a beautiful goal. I want to see more of that from the Kraken. That's the way they need to start playing in the offensive zone. Certainly, when you get a Burakovsky back, like I feel like that would open up his game so much, and maybe we can see then more consistent playmaking from him. We've talked about how he's a streaky guy. Talk about Oliver Bjorkstrand has really been the only consistent East-West player on this Kraken team all year long, but we know the kind of success he can have when he plays that way. I thought that Vince Dunn goal was a good example of how this team should be playing and the results that they could expect if they played that way more consistently. All right, so let's go back in time. I guess we'll just work in reverse. Let's go back to the Boston game. This was a fantastic game. I know it was a loss. It was disappointing in that regard, but it was one of the most fun hockey games I've ever seen, RJ.
I know, such a fun game, and to be there in person for that one. I mean, when you have players on the losing team like Yanni Gourde saying that was a fun game to play in, like right after the game when you'd think you'd be kind of the most frustrated about losing and all of that, it was a good game. And just the back and forth, the response goals, and for both sides too. Yep. We talked about the Kraken having a response goal issue. This was just a this game thing for both teams. Yep. No lead was safe, and that's what made it so exciting. And also just how much offense there was too. I mean, the teams never really just kind of battened down the hatches at any point. Mm-hmm. It was just so much offense, but great work to create it too. It was just like the teams were trading dominant offensive zone shifts with a strong forecheck, good puck retrieval, all the things you want to see as a coach, and just back and forth. One team would do it, then the line change, the other team does it. Such a fun game. Yep,
and 11 goals scored by 11 different goal scorers. That is definitely a rarity in this league, but it was a lot of fun to watch. As far as like major takeaways, I think the only takeaway you can have from this one is, look, this Boston team is 44-8-5 going into that game. That's incredible. Like absolutely incredible. Like, and the Kraken were right there with them start to finish. Well, at least until the last 3 minutes maybe. But the point is the Kraken played them really, really tough. We know we were able to go into Boston, give them their first home loss of the season in regulation there. You knew Boston was going to want revenge for that. There's very few things that can motivate any team like revenge. And for Boston, given how well they've played this year, very few opportunities for them to seek out revenge. But this was one of them. And they were able to get it done. But I thought the Kraken, they, for me, answered a lot of questions about, when we were asking, where are they in terms of the rest of the playoff teams and the rest of that pack? If you looked at this Boston game, you'd say they're right there.
Yeah, and it shows that they still have that level of play in them. We talked about it being over a month since they'd beaten a playoff team, but you can't question their ability to go toe to toe with a team like that when Boston comes to town and the Kraken. I mean, you have a lead on them with under 5 minutes to go. Mm-hmm. In a back and forth game like that. So I think ultimately it's a reassuring sign looking back at the week. And Vince Dunn said, he said it after the Leafs game, but he said we're not far off from the good hockey that we were playing and the peak hockey we need to be playing. We are really close there. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure the Boston game they'll make you feel like that for sure. It hurts going forward to not even get a single point out of that one. But still a lot of reassuring signs there.
Yeah. Do you think that should have been a bigger story for us? Is not just blowing the lead kind of late in the game, but the fact that twice earlier in the game, the Kraken had leads as well. Do you think that should have been a little bit more talked about?
Looking back at it, perhaps it certainly didn't feel that way that night in the building. It just felt like this was the kind of crazy, momentum that this game had. And that you're kind of just along with it. And I will say hockey's one of those sports where it feels like sometimes the momentum of a game could just take on a life of its own, and there's not
Yes.
really anything you can do to stop it.
Yeah.
If you've been to games like that, you know what I mean, listening to this, and it just felt like one of those. So I just didn't even, I thought about it, but I didn't think to blame the Kraken on that one. Maybe on that last one where, somehow you've got to find a way to not lose in regulation
Yes.
when you're up by one at the end there. There's little enough time left that you can just somehow make sure to hang on to things. But again, if you go into that defensive shell, Boston's going to eat you up. So
Yep.
I don't know. It's tough.
Yeah, it's really tough against a team like this Boston team. But yeah, it's an interesting idea. The other thing was in as far as like a negative from this game, I felt like this was actually a worse defensive performance than the Leafs game from the Kraken, as far as defenders losing guys in the middle, especially like the centers not being in the right spots defensively. Like I felt like the centers really for that Toronto game corrected from what we saw from them in this Boston game.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'd agree with that. Well, I'd say, the mitigating factor, I think Boston did a lot more to cause those the defensive issues. I think the way that they pass the puck. I mean, I texted you this during the game, but it reminds me of those mid 2010s Ducks teams where they will just slice you apart with passes. And even if you're trying to keep your head on a swivel and be in the right spot always, the way they move the puck is going to pull you out of position somehow. And it's very difficult. I feel like the Leafs didn't do as much to force the errors that were there. And, there were some lucky bounces like the Tavares goal, but the Kraken did adjust well, but I got to give some credit to Boston on that though.
Yeah, well, there's a reason they're in the position they're in, right? And then finally, the first game from this past week, and this one's a tough one for everybody involved. Again, I think the only good thing any of us can say is that, we're happy for you to have been able to cover a game at SAP Center. But that says a lot in and of itself, RJ. That San Jose game was just awful. No way around
it. Was. I mean, all around, it was one of maybe two games all season where the Kraken just, I feel comfortable saying this, just didn't show up at all. They never really did. And it was against a very depleted Sharks team, a Sharks team without Timo Meier or Tomas Hertl. There's no, real high end players on that roster outside of Erik Karlsson left. The Kraken didn't need probably their full effort to beat the Sharks that day, but they needed some, and they didn't really bring any. And you almost feel like you want to just write that game off. You could go through the X's and O's, but like when you bring that level of effort to a game, you're not going to beat any NHL team on any day.
Yeah, we're not going to hang on it too long. You talk about the effort thing, and that's one of the two things that I wanted to talk about from this game, because I did feel like, through most of this season, something that we've been hammering home about the Seattle Kraken team is that they never give up. They never have low effort games. They always feel like they can come back and win it, even if they're down by 3 with a minute left. They always play like they are still in the game, and that we've all been very, very proud of that effort level and of the way that this team has played. But I look at this Sharks game especially, and then I also look at aspects of the Toronto game once it kind of got out of hand for them. And those are the two times this season, and it's the only two times, but it's concerning because they happened less than a week apart, where I feel like that effort, that same level of effort wasn't quite there for this Seattle Kraken team.
Interesting. I mean, I would actually disagree with you on the Toronto game. I thought they put on some good pushes there and like responded well in the second period, and they didn't go away. And the third was, okay, well, we we put on this push and then it didn't work, and now it's kind of too late. But I disagree with you on the Toronto game. But San Jose, and then I would say the Islanders game would be the other one, the first one back after the All-Star break. But it is a little bit concerning to see that, and especially at this time of year with the points on the line like that you don't have. Basically, you just don't wake up at any point in the San Jose game, because there were times you go down 1-0, 2-0, like at a certain point that panic meter has to hit, right? And it just never did. So it's something to monitor going forward, but I'm not all that concerned about it. If we see another game like the San Jose game, certainly with a lot of non-playoff teams coming up on the schedule, then I'll really get ready on the panic button there.
Yeah, I had forgotten about that Islanders game because I completely blocked it from my memory. But it does kind of keep a trend going, because you look at that Islanders game, you look at the Sharks game, and then you look at also the same kind of comments coming out of that Toronto game of it. They were boring, right? And I think that
Yeah.
that is part of it, because for so much of this year, the Seattle Kraken have not been a boring team. And I think that's been tied kind of to that energy and effort level that they've played with, regardless of scores. They keep the games interesting. They don't make you want to kind of doze off or want to change the channel. But in those 3 games, that was kind of the feeling a lot of people had, looking at Twitter, looking on Discord, being in the post-game comments. So that's kind of why I lumped that Toronto game in there. The final thing that I want to talk about from this one, we mentioned it a little bit earlier, Martin Jones. Do you just kind of like with Philip Grubauer in the Toronto game, do you just kind of write this one off as a one-off and say, look, nobody was playing that well, can't read too much into it?
I mean, I guess to an extent, but with Jones, it was the
It was
continuation of a
bad.
pattern. Yeah, it was bad, and also because his previous few games also didn't look very good, and so I think you have to kind of lump it in with those as well. From that road trip post All-Star break, that Rangers game where he was kind of struggling to track the puck well and all of that. The Noah Gregor goal I think of in that Sharks game where you just need a save there to keep you
Yep.
within striking distance. At that point, when that goal is scored, it's game over pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, you need a save there. I think it's really good that Jones came in that Toronto game and looked good.
Yes.
I'm happy to see that, like really happy, because again, he didn't look good in that San Jose game. Nobody did, but I don't know. I would be more concerned about him than the rest of the team from that performance.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so final thoughts on not really the week, but as we look towards the week ahead and the trade deadline being Friday. Based on this past week, RJ, and based on the questions we had been asking about this team on last week's deep dive, do we feel like there has to be a greater sense of urgency for Ron Francis to maybe try to make a move, try to make an addition here? Or do we think that, look, it's just sort of bad timing for these games to have all kind of happened in the week kind of leading into the trade deadline?
I don't think that Ron Francis is going to deviate from his plan here. I'm sticking with that. I mean, as much as the losses piling up really does, make you think, do you want to approach it differently? I think he's going to stick with what his plan is, and I don't think he's going to force a move. Certainly not, any kind of panic move because they're losing. I think if the team had been winning, if they were on a 7-game win streak or something, then maybe that would cause him to think differently and not necessarily make a panic move, but okay, we really ought to go for it move. But I think it's probably, if anything, more likely that he stands pat at the deadline. I don't see him doing a whole lot, maybe a minor trade.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just what I'm thinking. I mean, what do you think, Dylan?
I mostly agree with that. I don't think we're going to see anything from him. I feel like some of the people that you would have gotten if you were going to really go for it and really say like, okay, we actually feel really good about this group, and we think that there's a good chance that, look, if we get hot, we can make a significant run this year. I think the players that you would have gone out and acquired are already gone, right? You brought up Ryan O'Reilly. I think that would have been perfect for them. We saw him last night help contribute to crushing the Kraken.
He was so good.
That line is absolutely broken, him with Tavares and Nylander. It's unbelievable how good that line is playing right now for them. So I look at guys like Ryan O'Reilly being off the board, and then I look around the rest of the league and I go, I don't know what the Kraken would do. I know there's still maybe a want or a need for another puck-moving defenseman, but that's not the thing that's going to take you from this kind of borderline playoff team to legit Stanley Cup threat. And if it's not going to be something that's going to take you to that next level there, I don't see really the point in then making the move. You know what I mean?
Right. And that's exactly where I'm at. And I kind of, just like map this out in my head, really, where you look at what the issues are with this team. And as we discussed, basically they're finishing, and the defense is a bit sloppy. Like, do you change someone out on the blue line?
Right.
And look, starting with the finishing, I mean, you're not selling out for a difference maker. That's very probably not. If you're going to do that, you go trade for Timo Meyer or Bo Horvat or someone that's already gone. And then any depth, for like depth finishing or even a face-off guy, like, I don't know how much of an upgrade it really is. I mean, Sam Lafferty just got traded right before we started recording this. Those depth face-off ads, like, are they that much of an upgrade over Morgan Geekie? I don't know. You have to start thinking like, okay, well, is like a Nico Sturm from San Jose enough of an upgrade on your fourth line to be worth doing anything about? And I don't think he is.
No.
So, you're looking at that. And then on defense, are you adding a Gavrikov? I think that qualifies as kind of selling out for a difference maker, and I don't think you want to do that in this spot. A lot, and the defense market's pretty inflated too. Does a Luke Shen make any kind of difference on this blue line? I don't think he does. There just aren't a whole lot of potential moves left that make any sense, in my opinion. I mean, the other key though, well, here I'll go to you here just to see if, do you agree on this? Like, just the moves don't. Yeah.
No, I absolutely agree. Certainly if it's going to be a rental, the only moves that make sense is if you're getting somebody who has control past this season that can be part of your 3 to 5 year window that we're in year 2 of.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, Ron Francis, I think he likes to look for players that borrowing the old, Doug Wilson terminology I'm familiar with, that makes sense for now and the future.
Right.
I do like that term. Now, question I got to ask you here, because this is something that we've thought about leading up to the deadline. It's been discussed quite a bit, and it should be, kind of put in a new light, I think, with the Kraken losing some games and maybe slipping in the standings a little bit. We've talked about being a buyer and how a lot of those moves don't make sense. But the Kraken are still in this position where they could potentially, in effect, be a seller at the deadline, which is weird to think about. And the move to make would be to move Carson Soucy. There would probably be some interest there. It's been rumored that maybe even you could fetch a first-round pick. I think that's a lot. If you can do it, you really got to think about it. But if you're Ron Francis, do these losses make you more strongly consider moving Carson Soucy?
Oh, that's really, really tough. I feel like you've probably already fielded all the calls on Carson Soucy, so you know what the offers are. I don't think there's that many dominoes left to fall that people would be waiting on before giving you kind of a best and final on Carson Soucy.
Gavrikov would be the only one I'd think of.
Yeah, that's the only one, and for whatever reason, Columbus seems like just hell-bent on getting way too much for him is what it very much feels like. So in that sense, maybe you could try to take advantage of the market and just go like, here's Carson Soucy, costs a lot less, basically like gonna give you the same level of performance, maybe. But so
go tell Columbus to go kick rocks, make a deal with me.
Exactly, go after Yarmo. It's not the red glare. I shouldn't go on my Yarmo rant. But it's I would definitely consider it, because the bottom line is, if Carson Soucy is not going to be somebody who's going to help you in the and future part of that, saying that you brought up, then there's no point really holding on to him now. As we've seen just in this last week, he was getting rotated out for Jacob Magna anyway. So I almost wonder, do you think those were instances where there was maybe a trade starting to look like it could happen, and so they held him out just to not have him get hurt, you think?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I
know you've been around.
What I saw, yeah, exactly. And especially like being in that, going to that game in San Jose, you kind of hear things about like, why decisions are made and all that. I don't think a trade was brewing. I think it was really just a desire to get Magna into another game, which is something you'd want to do anyway, just to keep him fresh, keep getting into games. So I don't think a trade was close there. But I think on the Soucy issue, like, if you can get a first-round pick or equivalent value for Carson Soucy, I think you do it. If I'm Ron Francis, if it's me making that decision, that's what I'm doing. And it puts you in a great spot because you can stand firm on your price. And if you don't move him, it's not the end of the world. And other GMs know you mean business.
Yes.
Like, that's a great thing where you don't have to budge on your price at all, and you shouldn't. And the signal that sends around the league. So I think he's in a great spot on that. But if you do get that offer, I think you have to take it. The one thing I wonder about, though, is optics and how much that plays into Ron Francis's mindset. I know ideally as a GM, you'd like to block all that stuff out. Yep. You don't want to think about, how this is going to look from the outside. You just make the best moves for your team. But I do think that could be a factor here, knowing that if that's the only move you make, you have become, in effect, a seller at the deadline.
Yep.
And with your team fighting for a playoff spot, and especially if they just go on another bad run and they somehow miss the playoffs, how that's going to look on you at the end of the season. The fact that you were a seller at the deadline, given where this team is at, and I think really needing to get into some playoff games just, for the market's sake to make your impact here.
Right.
I worry. I wonder if that's going through Ron Francis's head. And I know he hinted at, he did an interview with John Forsland before, on Root Sports before the last game during the pregame show. And he hinted at Carson Soucy being their, quote unquote trade deadline rental, being someone that you already just decide, okay, that's going to be our guy, even though he's a UFA, we'll hang on to him. I think he's kind of laying the groundwork for that potentially, and maybe knowing that it's not going to look good if you were to move him, even if you get a good deal.
Yeah, and it definitely wouldn't. You do worry about the message it sends to the rest of your team. From a confidence standpoint, you look at, we've seen that effect happen a lot for teams that have gone out and made moves, and you see then the result of that, and the teams really like take off because it's like, oh, okay, hey, guess what? Management believes in us. They think we've got a good chance, and that confidence does translate. When you're talking about a sport like hockey, where you're having to play that 82 game grind of a schedule, and you're talking about the way games are played and the kind of just flowy nature of it and how big momentum swings can be, confidence totally comes into play. And I think, that is always one of the best ways to kind of give your team a shot in the arm this time of year, where everything is slowing down and you're 60 games in and everybody's banged up and tired. And when you see teams make like an aggressive addition, you just can see that extra life it brings the organization. And I do think that a Soucy move could have the opposite effect, especially because your team is struggling right now, especially because after the All-Star break, you're 3-6-1, and you're having games like that Boston game where you can't get to overtime, or you're having games like that San Jose game where you just have like zero effort level through from start to finish. And I think that would be a very worrying thing. It'd be one thing if the Kraken were playing super well and you've got Megna and he's coming in for Soucy and he's playing super well, then like, I think a team could survive that a lot easier. But based on how things are right now, I agree. I don't think it would send a great message. And you all of a sudden worry, does that become the thing that tips you to be that one team out of the picture come playoff time? And you really can't afford to do that to this fan base and to the organization this year. So I agree with you. That would be something I'd have to very strongly consider.
Yeah, I mean, Francis has talked about messing with the chemistry a lot and not wanting to do that, mostly in terms of making an ad that would kind of push someone else out of a spot. But you have to think about it the other way too, and I think it's worth mentioning too. Carson Soucy, very well liked in the room.
Right.
That would not be a favored move with a lot of the players, I would think.
No, probably not. So that's kind of a good segue here into the big trade idea I have for the Kraken. Okay, and just remember the Carson Soucy thing. One of the things that I want to bring up and ask you as we transition into this idea, RJ, after we both kind of agreed, be fine for the Kraken just to stand pat. You don't need to go out or do anything. But we did get a message from TJ Singletone, one of our patrons, one of the great members of our Discord, everything like that, and he asked the question for the pod, which was, would you prefer the Kraken to use all 3 of their second round picks this year or trade for a controllable player? Right? Because obviously if you're trading away the picks, it's one thing to do it for a rental. As we talked about, this is not a team in position to trade for a rental. It would have to be for someone with some control there. Would you trade these second round picks for someone with some control? So just the idea of, it's a super deep draft this year, RJ, where these second round picks could be like the equivalent of first round picks in other draft years. Would you prefer that the Kraken kept all 3 of those second round picks and just really built out this prospect pool? Or would you prefer that they go out and try to find a trade where they can bring someone in to help out this year and in the future?
With how good the Kraken's amateur scouting has been, I think I'd actually prefer them to hang on to the picks. And the more that I look at this draft class, it looks so deep and so strong. The players that you can get with those second round picks, I mean, I'm just like kind of salivating at the idea of the Kraken, amateur scouting staff having 3 picks in the second round of this draft, and especially knowing where their timeline is really for contending. I think I'd rather they hang on to them. Again, if you get a great deal, I'll use the GM answer here. If there's a deal that makes sense, of course you've got to make it, and you can get better for now and the future. But I certainly wouldn't force anything. But I'm eager to hear what you have in mind that might sway me here on this opinion.
Yeah, so in my opinion, I mostly agree with you. I'd rather hold on to them, or I'd hold on to them till draft day, and then if there's a player I like, because you look at these second round picks, it's Seattle's second round pick, Toronto's second round pick, Winnipeg's second round pick. These aren't exactly going to be top of the second round level picks, right? So I think at the very least you have to hold on to them until draft day, and then if look there's a player fall into the end of the first round that you're in love with, or a player at the start of the second that you're in love with, maybe you do some sort of bundle there and you trade up a little bit. But I think you'd want to have that capital on draft day to use that in that way. There's only one trade that I would have the Kraken, in this incredible upcoming draft, dump picks. Okay, this is one trade. You've been up all night. You said trying to guess who I'm going to bring up here. RJ.
I know I couldn't sleep well because I was just trying to figure out who you were going after here. I have no inclination here. So you all listening to this are finding out at the same time as I am.
This would be
Let me have it, Dylan.
Yeah, this would be the blockbuster of all blockbusters. Okay, it would be the talk of the NHL town. I think the Seattle Kraken should try to make a trade for Jacob Chychrun. That is the player.
Oh, okay. I should have known you wouldn't have let that go. I know it seemed like you were joking when you talked the other day about like, oh, if LA can't get a deal done, Ron Francis, swoop in, do this. Okay. Make your case, Dylan.
All right. So we've talked about with the Seattle Kraken, they've got some good young forwards. You've got somebody like Vince Dunn, who's certainly in line for a nice contract extension. Looks like can be a solid piece of this blue line for a long time. You and I both know, though, the importance of having a defenseman on your team that come playoff time can play 29, 30 minutes a night, can move the puck, can be solid defensively, can do all of those things that you need them to do. I think Jacob Chychrun is that guy. I think the only negative to him is that he does have an injury history. Like that's the only negative with Jacob Chychrun. But when I look at him, he's 24. You look at the fact that he's got 2 years under contract at a steal of a contract at $4.6 million. Right? So you'd get him for a playoff run this year. You'd have him for 2 years after that. And then at that point, you can look at, re-upping him. The cap will have gone up by then. Like, who knows what kind of situation the whole team will be in as far as, extensions for Matty Beniers, a potential Shane Wright, all that kind of stuff. But I look at it and I go, if I can have 3 years of Jacob Chychrun, I want to have that 3 years because that helps us this year. That probably helps solidify the defense enough that you definitely can make the playoffs this year. And then the 2 years after that, it helps you come playoff time, try to make substantial runs. And the contract is enough that you don't have to really do anything to the rest of your team. That is just a very manageable, easy to digest contract. So I look at, well, what would that take? Because we obviously know Arizona wants a lot for Jacob Chychrun, as they should. But every day that goes by, every year that passes, because this was, a talk at last year's trade deadline when he had 3+ more years of team control. Every offseason and trade deadline that passes for Arizona, it's less and less team control on his contract, and the asking price is going to have to come down. That's just the way it is, right? I look at what would it take to do it. So pretend you're in charge of the Arizona Coyotes, RJ, and I'm Ron Francis, right. And I call you up. You're Bill Armstrong. I call you up and I say, we want Jacob Chychrun. Here's our offer. Okay. Our first round pick this year. All three of our second round picks. Okay. So that's 4 very valuable picks this year. One prospect, your choice, that isn't Shane Wright. You can have any other prospect from our organization but Shane Wright. You want Riker Evans? You got Riker Evans. You want Jagger Firkus? It's Jagger Firkus. Ty Nelson? It's Ty Nelson. Okay? And Carson Soucy, who you can then go and flip, but Carson Soucy makes the money work on our end. It's less money for you, and then you can flip him potentially for another first. So he's a good trade deadline asset for you to have while you still have, almost a full week to work with. If you're Bill Armstrong, do you take that deal?
Man, I thought you were going to come in weak with an offer here, but you didn't.
No, I had to make it realistic. And this is the only year where you can leverage the idea of having 3 second-round picks, as those 3 second-round picks really being valuable because of how deep this draft class is. And so, yes, it's a sellout from the Kraken standpoint, but you've already drafted extremely well if you're the Kraken. You have your young core. This gives you another young defenseman to have for these really solid contention years you have. I think if you're the Kraken, I would be considering it.
Again, I'm going back to being Bill Armstrong here in his chair. If it's me, I take that deal.
Yeah,
I really, because you're talking a late first in a deep draft class.
Yep.
You're talking picks that could be packaged for another late first in a deep draft class if you want to do that. You're talking about, I mean, again, the key here again, if I'm Armstrong, I'm looking for that best potential like prospect piece to match with the core that I'm building around in Arizona. And I'm asking for Byfield from the Kings. I'm asking for Grant Clark from the Kings. Sounds like the Kings don't want to give up either of those two, but I want more of a sure thing. The fact that I can grab any prospect aside from Shane Wright, because that's of course my first ask, off the Kraken. The fact that I can do that and kind of pick someone basically that's going to fill whatever need, do I want like Jagger Firkus just add to the ridiculous amount of scoring I'm going to have, with Cooley, with Gunther, do I want to grab like a Ty Nelson who I think it can fit on the blue line?
Riker Evans.
And then Susie again, who's probably, a late
at least a second round pick. Yeah.
At least a second round pick in the upcoming draft, another deep draft. It just adds up to more than I think, LA's offer is if they're not willing to move, Clark or Byfield. I might even go back to LA and be like, look, I've got this offer. I'm going to take it unless you give me one of Clark or Byfield. Last call. I love having this offer in my back pocket. I thank you for letting me play GM here. This is great. So yeah, I'd be like, hang on one sec. I'll get back to you by the end of the day. And then if
I'm driving into a tunnel, hold on.
Exactly. And then if the Kings don't play ball, I'm accepting your offer. So I think that's fair. Now I guess we got to go to, doesn't this make sense for the Kraken to do?
Right.
Because that is a hefty package.
It is a lot. I mean, you're talking about a good prospect, right? Regardless of who it is, whether it's Evans, Nelson, Firkus, whoever, it's you're losing a prospect, and then we've talked about all this podcast, how deep this draft class is, how incredible this draft class is. You're losing 4 in top 64 picks in this draft class, picks that you worked hard last year to get. You know what I mean? Like you did a fantastic job getting, but you're also, Ron Francis has already put this organization in a place where you have Matty Beniers, you have Shane Wright. You had 4 second round picks last year to help build out this prospect pool. You have those good prospects you'd only be losing one of. And you look at my team scouts really well. I trust in them. I trust in 2024, in 2025. We're going to be getting guys in the first and second round that are going to be able to come in and help us out during our competitive window. You know what I mean? Like you have that thought process, but it is a lot, but it's one that I'm enough of a believer in Jacob Chychrun, and I'm enough of a believer in having the 2 extra years. The fact that you're going to have 3 playoff runs with Jacob Chychrun under a very reasonable contract. That is enough for me, I think, to say that that's worth it from this team, because that is a big splash that puts you on the map. We talked about not wanting to send the message to this team if you trade away Carson Soucy. You send this message to the team that you bring in Jacob Chychrun, and it's like, hey, we believe the time is now, and the time is next year and the year after that. Like that, talk about a confidence boost for this group. I don't know. I feel like he'd help out a lot with the struggles that they've had so far this year too.
Yeah, I mean, I love the player. I'm not arguing with you on that. And this is the thing too. The Kraken basically have room for one more big ad. We've talked about this. And this would be it. And I'm not against having that big ad be on the blue line. We've talked about Bo Horvat or Timo Meier, some of these forward ads that you could make. I think the way this team is constructed and overall balancing the roster, and especially looking at the prospect pipeline coming up. You've got Shane Wright coming. You've got eventually a Jagger Firkus coming. Guys like Goyette, Ryan Winterton. You have a lot more forwards in that pipeline than you do defensemen. Like, Riker Evans, he'll probably be on the team next season, but he's not going to be a top 4 difference maker right away. Ty Nelson, still going to need some time. Chychrun kind of helps you bridge that gap in that time before your defense prospects are ready to come up and contribute for you if they can, because there's still question marks that need to pan out. I know I got to get to the answer of like, would I do this or not? Because I'm not going to shy away from that. I'm not going to give the listeners a cop out here. I still don't think I'd do it.
Okay.
And that's just because I like to think, again, longer term build, more sustainably. And I see this draft class as being kind of that final year with, you have a bunch of picks. You can load up, especially in this deep class, and have that be kind of the end of your core. And then you can start thinking about moving 2024 and 2025 picks to supplement that. Personally, that's the way I would do it. And also because this way, if you bring in Chychrun, you are really banking on this year, the next year, and the year after as the years you're going to go for it. And I understand the merits of that, because you're dealing with Matty Beniers, for 2 of those seasons will have not been paid the big money yet. And Shane Wright for all of those 3 who will have not been paid the big money yet. So you could argue that, like, in this modern NHL with the salary cap, especially if it's flat, like, those are your only real chances to contend, as crazy as it sounds. And so I get that, but I'd like to extend that window out just a little bit further, to the point where guys like, Jagger, Furcus, Ty Nelson can be actual contributors for you and not sell out at that point, for these next 2 or 3 years. I like the window just a little bit further down from that. So personally, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't say it's a bad move, but again, just, it's like GM styles, basically. I think this is kind of where you and I differ as far as how we build things. But I really do like this, though, because I think it's a fair offer. I think you've given me a really good scenario to ponder here.
Yeah, and it's one of those, like, I agree with you as far as, like, looking at it, and that's partly why I like Chychrun, and only Chychrun, as the only guy that I would even consider this for, is because he's only 24, RJ. And yes, he'd be a UFA at the end of that, but the fact that you have him within the organization, you'll know who he is, and because you already have him acquired, means that you can then, through next offseason, the offseason after that, make moves to set up to know where you're going to be money-wise. The Kraken have very few contracts that are going to be under very few players under contract at that point. You're looking at 1 year left of Jamie Alexiak, a year left of Jared McCann. You know what I mean? And 1 year left of Jaden Schwartz and Oliver Bjorkstrand. 2 years of McCann and 1 year of Bjorkstrand and Schwartz. That's it, right? And so you can, by already having him in, knowing that that is your player that you're going to have to give that big contract to, you can maneuver a lot easier than saying, well, look, we're maneuvering around contracts now. Which offseason is the offseason that we're going to want to have money around? And then, do we think we can get the player we want in free agency? Do we think we can trade for the player we want? Right? Like, it kind of just brings a level of certainty that you otherwise don't have if you don't have him within the organization already. And that's something I personally value. I haven't seen really any other general managers ever value that. So maybe I'm just totally off on an island, but I would much rather, guaranteed have that player for those years, and then be able to build and construct my roster contract wise around that idea, rather than trying to do that on the fly later. But, look at a team like Vegas, where they just move money around. They make it work. It's possible. You know what I mean? Right. There are teams that prove to us, Toronto, there are teams that prove to us that anything is possible at any given time. So maybe you don't need to worry about that certainty long term. But that was the only reason I consider it, because otherwise I'm with you. This is an incredible draft class. The Kraken amateur scouting department is fantastic. The way they work with the analytics department to determine who to bring in. I mean, all of it is incredible from the Seattle Kraken group. I'd love to see what they can do, having 4 picks in the top 64, or maybe it ends up being only 2 or 3, but they're higher. Whatever they decide to do, in Ron, I trust in all of that stuff. I just thought that is the one player that is kind of gnawing at me. And I'm going like, that's the one person I would love to see in a Seattle Kraken sweater that I think could really make all this work.
And I mean, it'd be fun. It'd be the talk of the hockey world for sure. And it'd be fun to cover, for our perspective.
Yes.
Yeah. It'd be really fun.
Yeah. And the final thing is, again, he's only 24. You're talking about what, these top defensemen, they really stay playoff relevant until they're 32, 33. Yeah. So you could extend him at the end of this contract and still feel okay about it, and he could still help you even if your window isn't, say, next season or the year after that. He would still be very much around and able to help out. So it's an interesting one. I want to hear people's thoughts on this, though, because that is
let us know what
massive
you think.
Thing. So whether if you're watching on YouTube, definitely leave us a comment. Hit us up on Discord, hit us up on Twitter, Instagram, all those places. I 1000% want to hear it. The other thing I want to see is, hey, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, as we close out the podcast here and we give our kind of closing shout out to Queen Anne Beer Hall, if you do go watch any of these road games at Queen Anne Beer Hall, please, please, please snap a picture, let us know, tag Queen Anne Beer Hall in it. They absolutely love when we can send people their way, and it helps us out, on our end too. It helps them know that they're, it's worthwhile working with us, all that kind of good stuff. So if anybody does decide to go check out Queen Anne Beer Hall, watch any of these road games, I'd love to see it, just because I had a fantastic time watching those games up there. I really look forward to and wish I could be doing that for this road trip again. And then one final reminder to all the patrons, tomorrow night's game against the Blues is our live game commentary. It's a ton of fun. RJ and I were live through the whole game, watching it with our Terror of the Deep tier patrons over on Patreon. If you're interested in joining us for that one, for tomorrow night's game against the Blues, the link is in the YouTube description here. Otherwise, it's patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey. But with all that said and done, RJ, I think we can finally end the podcast. Thank you all for joining us for this one, and we will see you all next time. Hey everyone, before we go, we just wanted to give a quick shout out to all of our awesome patrons over at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey, especially our Terror of the Deep patrons: Absurdly Sane, Alex, Andrew, Austin H, Austin W, Beef, Ben, Burnt Creme, Chris, Coop, Daryl, DJ Singletone, Duthin, Eli, Emmy Chan, Gaby, Gary, Harry Legionary, Jay, Joni, Joshua, Kepler,
Kitty B. Kraken, Kyle, Leanne, Lonnie, Mark, Maya, Michelle, Nunya, Paige, Paul, Rebecca, Sarah, Scott, Sean, Shoeshine, Steven, Striatic, Tasty Kobold, Team YMIAT, Tank Commander Ty, Tyler, and Wendy. Thank you so much for making all this possible. We really appreciate your support.